I think healing is possible for everyone. The human body is incredible, and to shift from being kind of use the term hijacked by trauma and really kind of controlled by trauma to being able to do what we want and live the life that we want, I believe is possible for everyone. So that is open to everyone. That is the key. It's in the body. And, and that's why we talked about how those physiological changes that happen in a trauma response, it's in the body, it's not just in the head. And so the way to healing is absolutely being in our bodies and moving through it. And that's where, the work that you're doing and that idea of movement and finding joy in movement is absolutely crucial. And it's about doing it in a way that feels right for that individual and at a pace that feels right for that individual. But it's absolutely key to healing.
Welcome back to Make Movement Matter. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dr Susanna Petche, a GP of over 25 years, coach and speaker, to talk about something rarely explored, how trauma changes our relationship with movement. From her own experience of complex PTSD, Susanna shares how trauma can leave us feeling disconnected from our bodies, how it affects our ability to exercise safely, and why what's often labelled as laziness is in fact a protective response. We explore how trauma is held in the body, how to spot signs that movement doesn't feel safe, and what it takes to rebuild trust in your body, whatever kind of trauma you've had, or if you simply want to move through life with more compassion and awareness. This conversation is full of practical insight and hope. Susanna, both you and I are members of an amazing speaker group called Mic Drop. And I've heard you talk quite a few times about your incredibly important mission, which you phrase as working towards a trauma-informed world. But it was actually an Instagram reel by Daryl Edwards, the fitness explorer, who's also been on this podcast, who talks a lot about play and the importance of play as an adult. And I think you'd been on a run or something, and it had triggered the thought in you that it's not necessarily about being lazy, as often we hear, in sort of public narrative, that is stopping many of us moving. It's actually much deeper than that. Mm-hmm. Often for people, it is much more about how safe they feel in their body to push themselves with exercise, because often various forms of exercise really can be doing that, but even more gentle forms. So this kind of drew me in because obviously I'm really intrigued by people's reasons to move and reasons not to move, both the ones that they are aware about, mm-hmm. The ones that the world is perhaps pushing on them, and making them feel shame or guilt, mm-hmm. for not doing the thing that they think is the right thing to do. But also then the sort of more subconscious level, that the things that they are not aware that are barriers. So we're going to really dig into this today, because you are a doctor who has got personal experience, and therefore having that lived experience has really informed particularly your more recent journey, mm-hmm. in the last 5 years. So I'd love it if we can skip back a bit to just give a little bit more about your journey, mm-hmm. so that people can understand where you're coming from, and why it's so important that we're listening to you and your view on things. So you tell me a little bit about your life and your world pre-2020, let's say.
Yeah, so I qualified as a doctor in 1999, and went through training and specialised in being a GP, and so have been working now like over 25 years as a doctor, and I've always been interested in mental health. I've always kind of veered towards that in general practice. Most of what we see is to do with mental health. And I've also worked on a senior level organising services, so commissioning services around mental health. So I thought I really got mental health. I've been aware that I have had issues with depression my whole adult life. Seen various therapists and doctors about it, been on antidepressants various times. But it was nearly 10 years ago when there were a number of things that happened, as often is that this kind of a sequence of things that kind of happen that led me to falling apart. And whether you want to say falling apart or having a breakdown or whatever phrase you want to put it to. But essentially at that point, I got diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
And that was a huge shock to me because I thought I really got mental health. And so I was completely baffled. I'd always been taught that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was to do with war veterans and combat. I didn't relate to that. So my experiences were to do with sexual trauma as a young adult. And it's not something that had been like a repressed memory. I'd talked to therapists about it and no one had mentioned PTSD. And I'd just been told I had depression. So it led me to exploring this and trying to learn more for my own recovery. And I found all of this research and evidence out there about trauma, how to recognize it, how it shows up, and what we can do about it. And that's then changed my working path. So initially I stayed in medicine and changed my practice. And then now, to try and have a greater impact, I've started a business and now I do teaching and training around being trauma informed.
Wow. So yeah, very, very much lived experience. And when you say about your time of falling apart, how did that present itself? What happened in your life at that point?
So literally, I talked about one of the experiences that I'd had with the therapist, and she gently suggested I might have post-traumatic stress disorder. I told her that was rubbish, but then went away and read about it. It was like, and it was like reading about myself. And the next morning, I was at work and saw a patient who made some very sexist comments, very derogatory comments, and that really triggered me. And I completed the consultation professionally. He exited, and then I just fell into a heap, sobbing on the floor. My colleagues came in, sent me home for a couple of weeks, and I was unable to work for 6 months. So everything about me, like I had extreme hypervigilance, so really struggled to sleep, incredible fatigue, really struggled with depth perception. So everything, my senses just went completely off. Struggled to eat, so felt very nauseous, all of the, really sweaty, feel my heart racing. And I really felt like I was going mad. And it was terrifying because my identity is very tied up with being a doctor and so using my brain and understanding. And so not having that and not knowing what was going on. And when I went to my GP, who was lovely, but treated me like a peer and a colleague rather than a patient, no one knew what to do with me. And I didn't know if I would ever get better. And that's what led me to then trying to research this and understand. And so I found books like Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. And that was really life-changing for me because it made me see just what is out there and that there are other options. And that's why, having conversations like this with you and talking about trauma and normalizing it so people can see it's not some weird thing that only happens to a few people. It's really common, and that there's so much that we can do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And exactly why you're here. I think it's hugely important. And I've talked about it quite a few times on this podcast, but the same book was the turning point, a huge turning point, not the turning point, but a huge turning point for me in my recovery from chronic pain. Because it was the realization that it wasn't me sort of thinking I was going mad and that I was making up all these symptoms and that there was nothing wrong with my body, but that there was so much more going on and that I had to go deeper. Tell me a bit more about, now that you look back, prior to sort of having this awakening about PTSD,
Hmm.
were there any sort of signals or any sort of little flags waving that you had been ignoring and not sort of associating with what was going to then culminate into that time for you? If you anything sort of physically, I mean, obviously mentally, you talked about the fact you had depression, but was there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't trust people. I found relationships were difficult. So getting to that point of trusting people and letting them in, constantly questioning everything. So real extreme hypervigilance.
Which would probably seem like a really good thing as a doctor.
Exactly.
Because then you're really drilling into the person's problems. You're all over everything. You're really getting into the detail, and therefore
Yeah.
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
A brilliant skill.
And one of the things that that we really notice with trauma is that being in chaotic, often unpredictable, potentially a little bit dangerous situations can feel normal because that's kind of what you're used to. So for me, working in situations like in A&E, where there's that unpredictability, you don't know what's going to happen. Like I trained in central London, where you don't know quite what's working the door, and you've got to be that real kind of hyper alert and see a few steps ahead of what's going to happen. I thrived in that.
And it didn't really affect your well-being in terms of, were you exhausted regularly, or were you, how was the rest of your well-being?
Yeah. So this is where it's a really great question, because outwardly I looked like I was a really high functioning adult, but inside fatigue was horrific. And so people always used to just joke, oh, you're just overdoing it. And so I was constantly keeping busy so that I didn't have to feel what was going on and notice actually how I was feeling. That was one part of it. Feeling utterly exhausted. Looking back, I clearly had something called PMDD, so premenstrual dysphoria disorder. So where people talk about PMT, where your mood dips pre-menstrually, so before you bleed. PMDD is where you feel really, really low and suicidal, or often suicidal. So I used to feel suicidal every month, and that would go various extremes to just thinking about it to then feeling like really, really suicidal ideation, self-harming, and yeah, just lots of odd pains, very, very heavy periods, and those symptoms were getting worse and worse, and so it was harder and harder to mask that, and so it was taking more and more energy to just show up in the way that the external world were kind of used to me being, and I felt I had to present that certain kind of way.
And I just think this is such the reason that I'm sort of leaning on this bit in particular is because I think we have a lot of people are functioning in society in that way, sort of regardless of whether it comes from deeper trauma or whatever. But as we've talked about already, there's layers of different levels of trauma that we're going to talk about in a bit. But I think there's such an emphasis on push, keep going.
Absolutely.
Push down they're not seen as symptoms by those people because they're just things that are happening. Oh, I have heavy periods, as in fact, it's not worsened by, or yeah, I'm going through episodes of feeling really low, but that's just because life's so busy, blah, 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 rather than realizing this is all one big thing that is happening, and it's going in the wrong direction. And yet we're normalizing that.
And the crucial thing with this is that I was repeatedly told it was my fault. So you're told that it's kind of normalized as that's just how it is. And it's kind of, well, that's how you are. So it's kind of your problem and your fault. So the consequence of that is that I internalized it all and blamed myself. And just that then evolves into really deep shame, complete lack of self-worth, not trusting your own intuition. Like, when people talk about, oh, you follow your gut feeling, had no idea what that was. And so that that's where that constant not trusting myself, not trusting people, and constantly second guessing, because you just that constant self-blame and self-judgment. So that's the problem. And if we think about how common trauma is, and that so many people will be walking around with that self-blame and self-criticism when it's not their fault, and there's so much, when we recognize it for what is really going on, there's so much that we can do to help people escape that constant loop.
Thank goodness for that amazing therapist that you saw, who sort of opened your eyes. And often it is, and that's the point of things like podcasts, and reading more, the dreaded Instagram, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes you can just read something, see something that makes you see yourself suddenly in a very different light, and allows you to get into that research. So moving into that sort of discussion about what trauma is, because there's an awful lot of, it's become a bit of a buzzword in some ways. It's great that it is talked about more, so that we can't put that as a bad thing, but it's important that there's sort of understanding about that. Now, you've had some seriously heavy trauma in your life. And people do have that, and that's sadly unlikely to change. There's always going to be traumas in people's lives. That's the nature of living, isn't it? But there's also, as we talked about, layers. So can you talk a little bit more? You obviously work a lot with people who have experienced trauma, to just shine a light on how, sort of, what the levels are, but what still constitutes as trauma that can affect our life.
So so we traditionally kind of tend to think about trauma being big things. So like I said, so definitely, things like war and combat, some huge accidents, natural disasters, assaults, childhood abuse. But what we often don't think about is the less visible. So things like emotional abuse, neglect, coercive control, bullying. And essentially, it's when somebody feels that there is a threat to their system. And it's not just the traumatic event, it's how they're met when that traumatic event happens. So, for example, unfortunately, a lot of women and girls, when they disclose some kind of sexual trauma, they're not believed. So that's then another layer on top of it, because they're not believed. So then there's a question of, well, what is my truth? Do I trust what happens is wrong? Do I trust my kind of feeling around that if everybody around me tells me it's wrong? Or when people go to the police, they're not believed. When they go to courts, they're not believed. So that adds extra layers of trauma around it. And that's where often, not always, if there is, say, some kind of natural disaster and there's lots of people involved, people are obviously, yes, impacted, but the lasting impact and the turning in on the self is less, because people can talk to each other and everyone's acknowledging that it was a thing. And so that in that can be really helpful in the healing process. So it's important to distinguish. It's not just the event, it's what happens around that individual. So at the time when something happens, when something traumatic happens, the body goes into an acute stress or survival response. And really, as humans, our purpose, what our bodies are there for, is about survival. So everything we will do is just a survival response. So all of the responses, the hypervigilance and the way our muscles tense up, all of that we can track back to that original survival response. And without that, none of us would be here. You and I, the listeners, none of us would be here without that response. So that's a normal, healthy thing that happens. The problem is that it sometimes doesn't get switched off. And so if we look at animals, when they've gone through something stressful, like say, if a gazelle's being chased by a lion, they either get caught and eaten and die, or they get to safety. And when they get to safety, they'll shake and discharge that excess adrenaline and bring the body back to balance.
And I'll just jump in very, very quickly. And we had on someone who teaches TRE
Exactly.
In the last series. So if you're interested in how you can do this as a human, then just go back to that episode. It was fascinating. And she said
exactly that. So TRE, trauma release exercise, is a treatment modality that taps into that shaking. And as humans, we don't do that. We just suppress it all down and we hold it in and we internalize it. And then especially if we're not, the trauma isn't acknowledged and we're not met and recognized and seen for what has happened, then it's internalized even more. And that's where the problem is.
Yeah. And that's where the shame develops, because it's all in your own head.
Yes.
And not shared and not discussed and not processed, not dealt with.
Yes. Yeah. And so it's the deciding whether something is a trauma or isn't. There's obviously the big things that are obvious, but it's all individual, and it goes together with our previous life experience, potentially also our family story. So, what one person might find traumatic is not necessarily what another person might find traumatic. For example, if you see, say, an elderly person collapse, that's obviously not something that someone wants to see, but for most people, you kind of get an ambulance and get them some help and etc. But for another person, that could be really traumatic if that elderly person looks like the grandparent who brought them up as their surrogate parent. So it's we can't just put that judgment on and say, well, that's traumatic and that isn't. It's very much individual as well to do with their own life experience.
Yeah. And it's also trying to recognize that is likely to happen to you at points in your life, to whatever level. It's not something we can avoid.
No.
And also, you don't know, as you're talking about, the personality and the way you are, as well as all your life experience that you bring into that.
Exactly.
How sensitive you are as a person, how deeply you empathize, etc., etc. All is wrapped up, as I have learned. So going back then into the more physical side of this, because you talked about the feeling of being unsafe, which makes absolute sense, because if you've had what is now perceived as a threat to you, so that gazelle being chased, then you're on the lookout for more, as they are, poor things, all the time. They are literally watching out, and that's why obviously they go around as a herd and they look out for each other. We haven't got quite the same. We have some to some extent, but not quite the same. So tell me a little bit more about how someone could understand what that means on a sort of a physical level. And then I'd like to sort of bridge that over to how that affects how you move, because often, I've had experiences with clients who have come in and I've been working with them. And one of the things that often is really quite triggering is when we go down to the ground, and we get into sort of early developmental movement patterns. And I don't know particularly why that is, but it can bring up a lot of emotion unexpectedly often. And therefore they can then make a connection. We can discuss sort of what's happening. But when someone isn't aware that they are dealing with something, or that might happen, what does that feeling of a lack of safety in their body, how does it present itself in normal life?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So essentially, a kind of an easy way to think about it, or one way in to think about it, is when we can try and tune into whether we feel in a contracted state or whether we feel in an expansive state. And a way to start exploring this, if someone doesn't have a clue what that feels like, is something that seems like a really simple thing. That you can have, for example, two different cups. and that you want to go and have a drink of water, and you're deciding which of these cups to choose. And it's really tuning into which one do you want to use and why, and which one, when you take it, you're just like, okay, that's okay. Or which one makes you think, oh no, I really want that one. Like, which one makes you feel like, yeah, that one, whether it's a mug of tea that feels round, that you can hold it like that and cup it in your hands. Is it the thickness of the china that makes you kind of, when you then put it to your mouth and drink from it, feels more comforting to drink? So using that as a way in of that, how does that feel kind of expansive, and really track how that feels in the body, and really notice how that is just with a mug or a cup or glass of water, whatever. And then it's noticing, when do you feel that in different situations? So when you're walking down the road, when do you feel expansive? When do you feel contracted? When you're talking to people, when you're talking to different people, how close do you stand? Different types of people, different situations. When do you start to feel that you notice, and it might not be that you're visibly doing it, but there's a sense of kind of tightening and contracting in your body, and a sense of like, this feels really great and I really feel comfortable here. So it's just starting to notice and track that is really helpful, to notice that sense of safety. And it's understanding that it's okay to feel that if you're, say, talking to somebody who you kind of think of as a friend, and you think, well, I don't know why I'm feeling in a contracted state, that feels really mean. No, it's not. It's just your experience. So it's not kind of trying to add blame or add any story to it. It's just how it is. So that's kind of the bit about safety. So thinking about how this kind of then affects people's ability to kind of exercise and movement. If we just kind of go back a bit and think about when people have experienced trauma, a lot of people will be familiar with the terms of flashbacks and triggers. And so the problem with trauma memories is that they are often misfiled in the brain. So they're filed in a place that is kind of to do with senses, so that it's a sensory bound memory. And it's not filed away in a logical sequence. So it's not in a time bound that we know, logically this happened and then that happened and that happened. It's misfiled in a place all to do with the senses. And so that's why we kind of typically think of a war veteran hears a car backfire and they think it's a gunshot and they crouch to the ground. So it's that sound has been the sensory trigger that has brought back that traumatic memory of being in combat, wherever it was. And it's not in the same of a normal memory of like, oh, that's when I happened to be at that place and this, that, and the other happened. With a traumatic memory, you hear or you feel or you see or you smell or you taste that trigger, and you're immediately back in that traumatic situation. And then you're feeling and experiencing everything else that you felt and experienced at the time of that trauma. So this is all subconscious. This is not something that is in someone's control. It just happens. Once we start to become aware and curious and notice this, then we can bring it a little bit more gently, slowly into our conscious awareness. But initially, this is all subconscious. So when we think about this in terms of exercise, if you think when somebody is in some kind of traumatic event, and even if we just think about, if you're going for an exam, everyone can kind of think of some exam that we've been to. When you're about to step into an exam, you're aware that your heart's racing, your palms are sweating, your breathing changes. When we do exercise, our heart's racing, our breathing changes. So that can be a physiological trigger, so like a feeling, a body trigger to trauma. Yeah. And so people, are being, as you said at the beginning, kind of the expectation is that we should be doing exercise and we should be raising our heart rate. And yet then people, they're trying to do it and they try and do it and they feel even worse and feel really unsafe, but we're being told to do it. So then there's something wrong with me and I'm lazy, and there's something wrong with me because I'm not able to do it, so I should do it more, and they just feel worse and worse. And
Yeah.
often what can happen is that the body's protective mechanism is then to make someone really fatigued or to have pain, so they stop doing it.
Yeah.
Then they can't do it, and that then keeps them safe.
Yeah.
Rather than being able to be aware of it, notice it, and be able to acknowledge to the part of them that holds that trauma that actually I'm now out of that situation, hopefully, that I am safe, that I'm choosing to do this for these and these reasons, which is all possible to do.
I hope you're enjoying the conversation. I'm just taking a quick break to ask you a question. Have you started to notice that the everyday things you used to do without thinking, like getting up off the floor, lifting the shopping, or hopping over a stile, now take more effort than you feel they should? Well, if your answer is yes, you are far from alone. And I'm excited to tell you that I've written a book to help you. It's called Move Well for Life, Unlock the Life-Changing Power of Everyday Movement. As you'll know from listening to this podcast or following me online, I don't talk about chasing fitness trends or imposing rigid routines. Instead, my message is all about learning how small, natural movements woven into your daily life can help you feel stronger, more confident, and ready for whatever life throws at you. Move Well for Life is available to pre-order now, and it's out in January here in the UK and Europe, and later next year in America. You can find the link in the show notes to read more about it, or simply search Move Well for Life and Wendy online. I firmly believe that every movement counts, and it's never too late to reclaim yours. Now, back to the episode. Particularly, I presume, with a level of support, but the first step is to recognize that that's happening.
Yes.
Whether you're aware that that trauma exists, because if it's a less than a large event, as we've discussed, but even on quite a typical, more basic level, I hear all the time about people who have really negative connotations with exercise because of school.
Yes.
Because and you know, we've all seen the whole, you know, that people laugh about sort of choosing people from the line, and you're the last one left, and everyone knows you're the last one left because you're the not sporty one, and you're going to let the team down. You feel like you're going to let all of that awful stuff. And there's so many more examples of that are then people carry it with them for life. And it then goes to the point that they don't move as much, partly because they sort of have branded themselves as not someone who can exercise, where everyone can, but also, as you say, that this movement, they're feeling unsafe because it's bringing back shame. And yet we all move all day long. We can't not move. And the way we move, there's so much discussion about how much we should do, and the sort of the lovely binary, you know, you've got to be doing this, you know, pushing, blah, 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 all the messaging that there has been, but also still is. And yet missing this huge chunk in the middle that's incredibly beneficial. And what I do starts from a very gentle level, but it particularly starts from the point of view of accepting where you are right now, surrendering that whole comparison and trying to cut out the noise of the world so that you can embrace what you've got to be able to start slowly and gently and trying to tune in to what feels better. Not necessarily good. I do talk about good a lot, but it's really about what feels better and what makes you generally feel better, not just in that moment, but also about yourself. You've made a very small, tiny achievement, but you can see it's taking you in the right direction. And I think that process is so much more important than the big wins and the goals, which are generally off-putting to many,
Yeah.
I would say, and I could even perhaps generalize to say
Yeah.
most. Um, and so this conversation brings in a whole nother layer where if you've had any kind of trauma like that, don't sort of belittle it.
Yeah.
Accept that that affected you and may still be affecting you now. You've talked before.
Can I just add
Yeah,
to that?
sorry, go
So,
on.
and I think the thing about is such an important point that you've just made, because so often it's a really normal survival mechanism to belittle trauma, because
Okay.
we need to get on with normal life. And so in order to do that, we don't feel, we deliberately, as a survival mechanism, our brains are so clever, they kind of shut off that part that was traumatized and that feels that, and pushes it down, pushes it away, so that we can get on with normal life. And that's part of the disconnect from the body.
And is that what you were talking? I can't remember if you talked about it, nor if we've talked about it, or you said it on the reel about disassociation.
Yes, so dissociation is where it's a survival mechanism, it's a protective mechanism to split off from the traumatic event so we don't have to feel it. So, for example, if a child is witnessing domestic abuse in the home, a child is dependent on those carers. So to fully embody that and to fully experience it and really be in the body to witness that and to feel everything around that is way too terrifying.
Yeah.
So they will then dissociate and split off so they can cope with normal life. And the problem is that when we dissociate, we don't necessarily really remember it in the right way. And that's why often trauma memories are kind of a bit higgledy-piggledy in the way that they're remembered. And that goes together with what we talked about earlier about them being sensory bound and not in that logical way. So the brain and body will kind of compartmentalize and put it away so that we can carry on with normal life. But it's still there in the subconscious. So dissociation tends to happen much more if people do not have a fight-flight response. So what I mean by that is when we're in that original survival mechanism and survival response in that acute stress cycle, where we're perceiving a threat and the body's trying to get us to survival, we go down fight, flight, freeze, flop, fawn, and the body just chooses what's the best way to survive. So fight and flight people are very familiar with, and you're using up adrenaline. It's physical. You're moving when you're doing that. Freeze, obviously, kind of standing completely still, or lying completely still. Brilliant survival mechanism, because most predators will track their prey with movement. So if they're completely still, then it might lose interest. Just think, I've made a mistake, and go off. Flop is that playing dead. So when you can see all of these on YouTube with animals, when like a tiger's just about to put the claws into a gazelle, and the gazelle will just kind of flop down as if it's dead. Most predators want a fresh kill, so it's not diseased.
Okay.
Or if they've got the claws in and the animal drops down and think, oh well, I have killed it, that was just an easy kill, drag it behind a bush, go off and get their young, at which time the animal can get to safety. Or fawn is that people pleasing, the submission, the going along with. Do you think about a cat and a mouse? The mouse will just go along with whatever the cat's doing in a hope that the cat will get bored, because a lot of predators, it's the chase, that's the thrill. And then when they're bored, hopefully you'll still be alive and then can get to safety. So all of these are brilliant survival mechanisms. There is no hierarchy with these to say if you fought or fled, you're stronger, more resilient, better in some way. That's absolute rubbish. It's simply what is your best chance of survival. Now, the problem is when somebody goes down the freeze, flop, fawn route, they still have all the adrenaline in the system. The physiological changes are exactly the same, but they've just held it all in. And it seems to be more common then that people dissociate when they're in that state. And so what happens is people then dissociate from the body. They don't feel what's going on in the body. So we talk about people with trauma are like heads on sticks, like heads walking around on sticks. So literally people don't feel what's going on.
Wow.
So what that means is that people don't feel when they're full necessarily. They don't necessarily feel when they're injuring themselves.
It goes back to your not knowing what gut feeling
Exactly.
meant.
That's exactly it. So you don't know what intuition is because you just don't feel what's in the gut.
Yeah.
So people talk about, so one of the somebody who's a writer who's written a lot about trauma, somebody now known as V, used to be known as Eve Ensler, talks about having had a massive ovarian tumor that was the size of a melon, didn't feel it at all. So it's that people just don't feel what's going on in the body. So that's where, when we're in a society where we're in that push, and they're going for it really hard, that's celebrated. So then when we say, go to the gym, go and do exercise because that's good and healthy, which obviously it is healthy, we know all the health benefits of it, but we're told to go, don't have that intuition of what feels right. Kind of something in us is telling us that it doesn't feel right, but we're not aware of that safety feeling. And we just think, well, there's something wrong with us because that's what we've always been told, that it's our problem. Don't notice that we're over pushing ourselves to the point of injury. Again, blame ourselves because we should be able to do it. And then just go into that cycle. And that's where it's really harmful.
And, this is such interesting sort of way the conversation has gone, because we've gone from one extreme of feeling anything that is sort of towards that movement brings up in any way, let alone exercise, makes us feel unsafe, to the other end of the spectrum where you're not feeling at all and you're pushing like anything and have no idea the sort of subliminal damage, let's say, that is being done. So it's really very, very complicated.
Yes.
And yet it's all about being aware what could be affecting you.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose the only way to get to that is by starting with how do I feel in general? What are what's the way I'm living my life, and so not necessarily feel in my body in general, but is it generally going in the right direction, or am I having, as you had, potentially episodes of depression that could have come from other things and not necessarily been something you would have had otherwise? Or are you, like you were saying about those sort of flags earlier on when you were working, do other things not stack up where everyone else sort of isn't necessarily talking about that? Or why are they increasing? Why are they? Because what we don't want ever in life is to culminate in a catastrophic event, which is effectively what happened to you, because we haven't leaned into, is this right for me? And is this working? Or, as you were saying, relationships, why am I struggling to have more balanced and easier relationships? And why don't I ever feel like I can relax?
Yeah.
And all of that is hugely affected by exercise, because then when you're pushing like anything, then, what are you doing to your nervous system? You are literally upregulated all the time. There's no way that your system can relax. And again, that's why also people who go into sort of trying to use meditation and so on can really struggle and find it really, really emotional, because something's trying desperately to come out that, it has been struggling to come out. So to move on to sort of how we rebuild that trust in ourselves, it's obviously incredibly complex and nuanced. There's no sort of, just do this, just like lovely Instagram, here's your list of 5 top tips to do blah blah blah, which I don't believe exists for anything, but people seem to like it. But how do we start to recognize, and obviously this comes to your work now, because you've worked with lots of people since you've moved into this sort of understanding trauma, for helping people understand their trauma. How do we start to help people to feel safe and recognize that perhaps their issue with wanting to move, knowing it's good for them, wanting to bring that element into their life, but feeling scared of it for whatever reason? How do they sort of make a start?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to say that's really important is I think healing is possible for everyone. The human body is incredible, and to shift from being kind of use the term hijacked by trauma and really kind of controlled by trauma to being able to do what we want and live the life that we want, I believe is possible for everyone. So that is open to everyone. And I think the starting point is um, to just have curiosity. It's just curiosity with our bodies and what we're feeling, or what we're, in and it may be that we can't localize, so be really clear in which part of our body we're feeling something, and we can't necessarily name it, but there is something that we can feel is off. Our experience is true, is genuine for us. So we can't have someone else say, well, you don't feel that. I mean, that's often what we've had our whole lives. But if someone feels something and feels somehow a tension, then something doesn't feel right. Something's unsafe for them. And it's just being then curious, well, what is it about that? And where is it? And where actually do I notice it? Can I give that a shape? Can I give it a color? Does it come with a sensation? So it's just having curiosity and exploring that. And that's something that people can do on their own, or obviously with support. The other thing that I think is a really good thing to do, which kind of alluded to a bit earlier, is shaking. So we can do that kind of shaking every day, even if we don't quite know what the original trauma is, because it may be that we've buried it for, just dissociation, or it may be that it happened when we were very, very young. So you don't need to exactly remember what it is, but shaking can be really helpful. And that can be literally shaking. It can be dancing really vigorously. So it's not kind of like cool dancing. It's like really like going for it. If movement is difficult or painful, even lying in a bed and doing like a toddler tantrum of like punching the bed and kicking the bed can be really helpful. So what I suggest for people to do is even to put a timer on their phone for just 30 seconds. Doesn't need to be long. And just doing that as a daily thing to just consciously let go of stress and tension in the body. And then you can do the relaxing part. So it's exactly what you say. A lot of people find meditation and breath work very difficult because they've got this tension. So if we can discharge some of that tension and then do the relaxing, even if we just do 30 seconds of shaking, a minute or two of meditation or breath work, that can be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, especially if you can get into a sort of a slightly consistent routine with it, because then there's also sort of the preventative.
Yeah.
I always talk about how can you link this to your day so that it is not difficult to remember, because there's such long lists of to-dos in
Yes.
all of our lives. So it's what is the time, or what is the thing you can link it with, and what's the best time of day? Would that potentially set you up better because you do it straight away in the morning? It's literally the first thing that you do. And quite frankly, an energizing stomp and wriggle and rah in the bed. I mean, the person next to you, if you have one, may wonder what on earth is going on, and it might be a rude awakening for them. But to do that is also brilliant for getting you energized and getting you up.
Yeah.
And then you might actually feel like you want to have a stretch or a little mobility session, a few gentle moves that you can start to add on, and start to investigate the feeling
Exactly.
of movement in the body, and just sort of invite in the fact that this is a possibility for you, rather than this isn't for me,
Yeah.
or I can't, or it's not good for me, or it's just,
Or
it's
it's
not
just
for
not
me.
me. I don't do that.
Just not
I'm
me.
not someone who exercises. And
Absolutely.
it's something that you can involve kids with, to just kind of do that shaking and stomping. Kids are great at doing that. They don't need to know why. So you could just involve them and just make it fun. And I think that's the
Yeah.
thing, that exploring trauma and healing from trauma doesn't need to be all really serious. Obviously the original thing is horrific, but we can have fun while we're doing it. We are allowed to do that.
Yeah. So this has been a hugely valuable conversation, mostly because I think people could listen and hear certain things that you've said and identify themselves in it. Maybe not the whole thing, but parts. And I think that's the key,
Mm,
that ultimately there is trauma affects all of us
mm.
in a variety of different ways, but it's very rare that you can completely escape trauma for an
Yeah,
entire
yeah,
lifetime. And therefore that may be having an impact on you. Now just to end on a light note, because one of the things that I love that you do, which you probably didn't expect me to bring up, is your drumming.
yeah,
So one of your tantrums,
yeah,
but on a
yeah,
drum.
yeah, absolutely, exactly.
So tell us a little bit about your hobby, because I love to talk about different types of movement, but particularly things that bring you
Yeah,
joy whilst you're moving and you're in a moment. So tell us what you do.
yeah. So I'm in a samba reggae drumming group, and it's amazing. It's just so much fun, and like you say, there's a real like cathartic element of banging a drum. There's something about feeling of the vibrations of the drum
Mm.
through my body, and it's doing it in a group. So when you're kind of in it and you hear all the vibrations of the drums, it's amazing. And we do choreography with it, so there's a lot of
Right.
movement with it as well. So um, it's something where I've only recently started consciously working with a personal trainer who really understands trauma, and it's been so helpful to do that. Before, I found it really difficult for all the reasons we talked about. So my way in was doing something that is fun, where I don't think it's exercise, but it really is. We're all like
It
hot and
really
sweaty at the
is.
end of the rehearsal. And it just brings so much joy. So it's absolutely just finding something that is just joyous.
Yeah. I, and that I always talk about the movement ripple effect, because when you start to move, and I suppose the subtext from this conversation is, and start to feel safer,
Yeah,
then you are giving yourself permission to do a bit more, to try something different, to say to a friend, I don't feel safe, but I really want to try that thing.
yeah,
Will you do it with me? All of that
exactly.
then can lead to great things. Just on what you said there about finding someone who understands, who you can then train with. It's a really good point, because there's probably a lot of people who wouldn't be right for that.
Hmm.
How do you think someone could go about finding someone that's right, if they really wanted to have their hand held or given that accountability poke from someone who they're going to work with? What sort of would be the right questions to ask to make sure that they are led in a way that they feel safe, but is also, particularly the thing that I feel strongly about, is at their pace
And
rather than being
that's the
pushed?
crucial thing. So I think it's about being curious about what you want as an individual, like and what's your goal, what's your purpose. Um, so like for me personally, it's just about me being fit and strong, and I've had lots of back issues, which I now know are due to hypermobility, and um, but it's finding someone and being very discerning about who you work with, and it's okay to not work with someone who maybe your friend is, who's got a different body, different experiences. um so specifically looking for somebody who understands trauma, so that's what I've done. Who understands working with women at my age. So I'm perimenopausal. So
Yeah,
obviously the hormones all have an impact on the body.
absolutely.
Um, and then what I really loved is that this person, so I found them doing an internet search. I wanted to work with someone in person. I wanted to work with someone one-to-one, because I didn't want people watching, because that's another thing that I felt really self-conscious at the moment. Um, and then we went for a walk in a park and had a chat. And so I could get a
Brilliant.
sense of what she was like. And so she's called Jenny Dunn, and she was just amazing how she talked about safety and trauma and feeling safe in the body and going at my pace. And hearing somebody just naming those things and going at my pace and constantly, so whenever we work together, it's constantly checking into how I'm feeling and what feels right at my pace. has just been a complete revelation. So I think there are people out there, and more people are understanding the importance of trauma and safety. And I think it's just that thing of, it's okay to choose who you want to work with. And if it doesn't feel right, it's also okay to say, I think we're going to just, leave it there and find someone else.
Totally have to agree. It's absolutely got to work. It's a really key relationship, particularly if you're going to be investing. So it's not cheap. It has to be right, and you're absolutely. And yet it can be difficult to break off after a while or whatever. But if it's not feeling right, then you're getting negative benefit. You're really not getting anything from that session, because your body will be in protection mode, which is the exact opposite of what we need to make those sort of beneficial moves forward. So I think that's really, really good advice. And I talk about in my coaching that I half coach movement and I half coach confidence. And that's not just confidence in terms of building up towards doing some difficult thing. It's much more about confidence in self, in body, and moving away from fear, in a sense.
Absolutely.
So, and confidence is not a thing. I've really, really come to be much more aware of that in all parts of my life. Confidence is not a thing. It's a becoming more confident, moving towards and moving away from difficulty. And that's what gives you that empowerment that you think, I can do this. And you then can visualize a different future for yourself. And I know that movement is hugely beneficial for people who have experienced trauma, to be able to work through and process in lots of different ways, but it's got to be right. It's got to be the right level, as you say, with the right person, and obviously layered with all wonderful people like you who can support people to really understand what is happening in their journey post-trauma.
It's such an important point you've just made, and that it's we talked about this book, The Body Keeps the Score. That is the key. It's in the body. And, and that's why we talked about how those physiological changes that happen in a trauma response, it's in the body. It's not just in the head. And so the way to healing is absolutely being in our bodies and moving through it. And that's where, the work that you're doing and that idea of movement and finding joy in movement is absolutely crucial. And it's about doing it in a way that feels right for that individual and at a pace that feels right for that individual. But it's absolutely key to healing.
Yeah. Oh, so fascinating, so interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Susanna. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what are your where do you live online?
You can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn as Dr Susanna Petche, and my website is trauma-sense.com. So I'd love people to get in touch.
Absolutely, and we will be linking to them, and also, so obviously, as I said right at the beginning, Susanna also speaks about this topic and far broader as well. So also it'd be, if you would like to get Susanna to come and talk to your group, then or even conference or whatever, then I'm sure you'd be really, really pleased to do so. And you've got so much great stuff to say. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
I hope you've enjoyed listening, and if you have, you can help by doing 3 things. First, press the follow button to tell podcast platforms you want to listen again. Second, please give the show a 5-star rating and leave a review about why you liked it. And third, I'd love you to share it with friends and family or on your socials, for which I'm truly thankful. Finally, if this podcast is making you want to start reclaiming your own movement, join me in the Reclaim Movement membership for classes, both live and by replay, and countless videos of mini movement breaks to add into your daily life, covering practical and fun, important natural movements. Visit reclaimmovement.co.uk/membership to get started with your 7-day free trial. See you for the next episode, and thank you so much for listening.